A beautiful afternoon, a lovely crowd, a taste of bitters and light returning to the faces of heroic stone. One day there will be amusements everywhere, good fun for our mortality. He has whistled. He has flicked his cigarette away. Alone amidst women he has gone off to a fancy flutter at the races. And redeemed, he has been redeemed, for there is no pathetic fun or mournful frolic like our desire, the consummation of the sparrow's wings. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I'm going to be talking about The Lime Twig by John Hawkes. This one came out in 1961, a little over a decade since his first novel, The Cannibal, and I highly recommend that if you've only given one John Hawkes book a shot, please try another one that has some years in the margins around the one that you tried, because John Hawkes is one of those artists who continued to work at his craft throughout his long and voluminous career. I'm talking about The Lime Twig specifically because this one is typically cited as not necessarily his most accessible or most widely appealing, at least amongst literary fiction audiences, but because it also includes so many of John Hawkes's hallmarks, the signature style, the themes that abound in his fiction. He was famous for saying that he didn't really even know what plot was. He didn't care about characterization and setting and plot. He wanted to create these lunar landscapes, as he called them, and get more at the psychological superstructures that are driving men and women to their fate. This one has the feel and the ultimate finish on the palette, if you will, of a Nathaniel West story. I'm thinking Miss Lonely Hearts, The Day of the Locusts, both of which I've covered on this channel. There's a reckoning with devastation. Perversions of the human heart are constantly leading characters into oblivion, annihilation. And fun fact, John Hawkes started working on a biography of Nathaniel West, but ultimately abandoned it because Hawkes said he couldn't stand writing the biographical form. The Lime Twig is ostensibly a parody of a pulp novel, a crime noir that takes place around the seedy underbelly of English horse races. A young man colludes with a middle-aged man to concoct this plot to steal a horse and enter it into the Golden Bowl at Aldington under a fake name and win all this money. But these gangsters get wind of what's going on and they collude an even grander scheme because, they have lots of experience, whereas the two everymen do not. And it all ends in, of course, a cluster. But the way this is written is so typically Hawksian. It's been cited over and over again that there are affinities here with DeJuna Barnes and with William Faulkner. The breathless pacing of this book at 175 pages, yes, it's already short, but the pacing of the way that the story's told gives the impression that Hawkes is telling this in one vigorous exhalation. The hypnotic prose grips you immediately from page one and does not let go. I could scarcely remember to highlight and jot notes and things like that because I was white-knuckled gripping this thing, turning its pages, devouring sentence after sentence. On the sentence level, the prose level, William Gass says, "From the first, John Hawkes's prose had sounded what Henry James would have said was the right note. The lines of The Lime Twig are as alive as few in our literature are. They compose a prose of great poetry, a language linked like things in nature are, by life and by desire." It's a stylish and seductive prose. It's used so well to keep what's going on in the novel enshrouded in mystery. Usually there's a literal enshrouding or enshadowing, whether it's fog in an early morning or smoke coming from a fire or steam from a train, vapors in a steam bath. There's all this enshroudedness. There are several images of an old light bulb, bare light bulb swinging and its cone of light kind of arcing back and forth and lighting things. And in the Roy Flanagan piece on John Hawkes in the Review of Contemporary Fiction from summer 2000, he notes this same thing and says that Hawkes's prose was often like a flashlight being waved about and alighting on things in the darkness. As Leslie Fiedler says in the introduction to The Lime Twig, his characters move not from scene to scene, but in and out of focus, for they float in a space whose essence is indistinctness, endure in a time which refuses either to begin or end. Hawkes loves this sense of bringing the characters outside of time. There's a temporal suspension that occurs when the characters give in to their desires. These desires are for ephemeral temptations, certainly, but in this devastated landscape, Hawkes shows us that what we really desire, or rather what these characters truly desire, is self-erasure. As Fiedler says, each lover, meaning each lover in this novel, under cover of whatever images, has ultimately yearned for his own death. Nonetheless, Hawkes has an incredible sense of details. And just as William H. Gass talks about in his introduction that he wrote for the John Hawkes Reader, he talks about how at first he missed it. He almost missed out on the greatness of Hawkes, and he had to go back and reread. And it was a snag on a seemingly perfunctory detail, reinvigorated with some strange alchemy that even Gass can't quite put his finger on. I too was snagged on some of these almost throwaway details. For example, when a breeze blows over a couple of the characters, one of the characters notes a long hair that's on his shirt that flutters in that breeze, and then he picks it off. And I just thought to myself, what a wonderful detail. The hall bulb shone orange through the cracks round the door, and moonlight was coming through the cobwebbed window. Across the floorboards, the moon was one square and silver-tinted patch of light, within which, in a silken heap, lay a stocking that wanted fingering. Next to it, a safety pin which, by moonlight and with point unclasped, looked charmed and filigreed, as personal as a young girl's fallen brooch. Early in the book, when young William Hencher has returned to a place where he used to live with his mother in squalor, he sneaks into the bedroom of the husband and wife who live there, and he stares down at their faces. And this is how Hawkes narrates this moment. Behind each silent face was the dream that would collect slack shadows and tissues and muscles into some first mood for the day. As the dutiful wife is taking this journey alone, which is clearly way out of her comfort zone, to go and meet her husband at these horse races, in one moment she is looking out of the windows of the train car, and the prose says, a sudden roll of smoke passed the windows, and she saw herself, and her eyes ached, and already she had been in her clothes too long. That immediately put me on so many flights that I've taken where I've awakened at 3:30 a.m. on a plane, 7 hours into a flight, bleary-eyed, and that when I've been through airports all day and, cross time zones, that perfectly sums up how I feel. I had been in my clothes too long. I guess it's also sort of a penchant for nakedness. And what did the inside of the train smell like to this woman who is totally outside of her comfort zone? The train smelled like the inside of an old man's hat, smelled of darkness, hair, tobacco. But the ultimate detail is the detail that's given to us in the room that this woman finds herself in. Not reunited with her husband yet. They're kept separated in this wayward and thwarted journey for both of them. But listen to this detail. The room was on the second floor, white, large. It had a closet with a sink in it. There were 2 brass beds covered with sheets, a picture of a girl in a lake. It was clean, but a pair of braces had been forgotten near the window. What a detail. A pair of braces had been forgotten near the window. That immediately evokes what Freud called the uncanny. All of our central characters, the only ones with whom we can really empathize at all, are all so disrupted. In the long essay on John Hawkes by Roy Flanagan, he says, as a boy, Hawkes worked in a stable where he developed a fixation on horses that would later find frequent expressions in his fiction. And indeed, that is a huge expression here in The Lime Twig. In this rich desolation, as Hawkes called it, in the landscape, growing up alone, mostly with his mother in Alaska, there were abandoned mining towns, a crashed plane covered with barnacles, and poor Indians housed in shacks. And that crashed plane covered with barnacles, you can see how that childhood impression is brought into the plane crash that takes place early in The Lime Twig. We're obviously in Blitzkrieg, London. And these opening pages, about the first 30 pages, I think, are given over to the young boy, William Hencher, and his mother and their destitution. Hawkes flunked out of Harvard in 1943 and tried a couple of different things, but then returned to Harvard and began to write prose. And then Albert J. Gerard noticed Hawkes and was instrumental in helping get Hawkes noticed. He even wrote the introduction to The Cannibal. And with The Lime Twig, he totally rejected the first 3 attempts and told Hawkes it had to be completely rewritten. Who knows what they looked like, but we see that Gerard was very good for Hawkes. This same guy, Hawkes, who would flunk out of Harvard, would circle all the way back and not just be a student, but actually start teaching at Harvard. And then he would go on to be a full professor at Brown University. Flanagan notes that his work as a mentor and professor earned Brown University a nationwide reputation for training talented experimental fiction writers, such as David Foster Wallace, Jeffrey Eugenides, and Rick Moody, many of whom credit Hawkes for his expert teaching. Flanagan does a good job of classifying the main 3 reactions or schools of reception and criticism for Hawkes. One is the more conservative reviewers who totally hate that Hawkes doesn't adhere to the realist fiction, and they see his work as mannered incoherence and pretension. More receptive critics avidly followed his career and enjoyed filling in the lacunae of his prose with their analysis, finding a wealth of symbols and myth and thought-provoking takes on the nature of art and perceived experience. So basically using Hawkes as launching pads for their own thoughts. And then lastly, creative writers often praised his work for its daring experimentation, its metaphorical imagery, and its refusal to bow to commercial pressures. If we listen to Hawkes himself, he says, "I want my fiction to destroy conventional attitudes and conventional morality." If you haven't read Hawkes yet, The Lime Twig is a great place to start. If you've only read one of his books, and it was The Lime Twig, please consider another one. I suggest his very first, The Cannibal, or if you're more into challenging, difficult literature, why not try The Beetle Leg? I think I've said this about Miss Lonely Hearts. The same is true of The Lime Twig. It's a little nail bomb of a book, but it sure is a delightful pleasure to read while its shrapnel is shredding you to smithereens.